Lisa Thompson's hands trembled as she read the text from her landlord. "You never should have moved into my house." It was 3 a.m., and the carbon monoxide detector was screaming in the hallway. She ran to her son Isaiah's room, shaking him, begging him to wake up, but the 10-year-old boy wouldn't open his eyes. What Lisa didn't know was that her landlord, Richard Palmer, was watching from his window next door, waiting to see if his plan had worked. In 6 hours, Isaiah would be pronounced dead, and Palmer would learn that the judge deciding his fate had lived through housing discrimination herself. Lisa Thompson's hands trembled as she read the eviction notice taped to her apartment door. Property condemned, 30 days to vacate. She had known this day would come. The building had been falling apart for months, but knowing didn't make the reality any easier. Behind her, she heard her 10-year-old son Isaiah asking what was wrong, his voice still carrying that innocent belief that adults could fix everything. She turned to him with a smile she didn't feel and said the words that every parent says when they're terrified but trying to be brave. "Everything's going to be okay, baby. We're just going to find a new place to live." What Lisa didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known as she hugged her son in that dingy hallway, was that her search for a home would lead them into the path of a man whose hatred would destroy their lives. Richard Palmer had spent his entire life believing that some people deserve better than others, that the color of your skin determined your worth, and that his property rights gave him the power to decide who belonged and who didn't. And in 6 months, Isaiah Thompson would be dead because of it. The search for affordable housing in Detroit was a nightmare that Lisa had been dreading for years. On her nurse's salary, which barely covered their current rent and expenses, finding a decent place in a safe neighborhood felt impossible. She spent her lunch breaks scrolling through rental listings, her heart sinking with each one that was either too expensive, too far from Isaiah's school, or in areas where she knew her son wouldn't be safe. She had grown up in Detroit, had seen neighborhoods rise and fall, had witnessed the systematic disinvestment that left black communities with crumbling infrastructure and limited options. But she had also inherited her mother's fierce determination, the belief that with hard work and perseverance, she could build a better life for her child. When she saw the listing for a 3-bedroom house on Maple Grove Avenue in a quiet neighborhood with good schools and a backyard where Isaiah could play, it felt like a miracle. The rent was at the very top of what she could afford, but it was possible, barely. The photos showed a clean, well-maintained house with fresh paint and hardwood floors. Lisa called the number immediately, her fingers crossed, praying that for once luck would be on their side. The phone was answered on the 3rd ring by a man with a gruff voice that immediately put Lisa on edge. "Palmer Properties," he said, the words clipped and businesslike. Lisa introduced herself, explained that she was interested in the house on Maple Grove, that she was a registered nurse with stable employment and excellent references. There was a pause on the other end, a silence that stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. "You still there?" she asked. "Yeah, I'm here," Richard Palmer said slowly. That property, it's actually already been rented, just haven't taken the ad down yet." Lisa's heart sank. Oh, I see. "Do you have any other properties available in that price range?" Another pause. "Not right now, but you can check back in a few months." The conversation ended quickly after that, and Lisa sat at her nurse's station feeling the familiar sting of disappointment. She had been so hopeful, had already imagined Isaiah running in that backyard, had pictured them building a life in that house. But rental market was competitive, she told herself. Someone else had just gotten there first. It happened. Except it hadn't happened. 2 weeks later, scrolling through the listings again during another desperate lunch break, Lisa saw the same house, still advertised, still available, the ad refreshed with a new posting date. Her stomach twisted with a suspicion she didn't want to acknowledge. She called again, this time from a different number, and when Richard Palmer answered, she altered her voice slightly, made it sound lighter, more tentative. "Hi, I'm calling about the house on Maple Grove Avenue?" "Yes, it's still available," Palmer said immediately, his tone much friendlier than it had been during their first call. "Would you like to schedule a viewing?" Lisa felt anger rising in her chest, hot and bitter. "Actually, I called about this property 2 weeks ago and you told me it was already rented." The silence that followed was heavy with caught lies and unspoken prejudice. "I don't know what you're talking about," Palmer finally said, his voice hardening. "If you're interested in the property, you can come see it. If not, I have other calls to take." He hung up before she could respond. Lisa Thompson could have walked away. She could have accepted that some people were never going to treat her fairly, that her skin color would always be an obstacle, that fighting every battle would exhaust her and change nothing. But she thought about Isaiah, about the schools in this neighborhood, about the promise she had made to herself and to her late mother that she would give her son every opportunity to succeed. And she thought about all the other black families who had been told, "It's already rented," when it wasn't, who had been pushed into substandard housing because landlords like Richard Palmer believed they had the right to discriminate. So instead of walking away, Lisa called the Fair Housing Center of Metropolitan Detroit, explained what had happened, and asked what her options were. The attorney she spoke with, a woman named Jennifer Rodriguez, listened carefully and then outlined a plan. They would document everything, send a white tester to inquire about the same property, build a case that would be impossible to deny. "If you're willing to fight this," Jennifer said, "we can not only get you that house, but we can make sure he never discriminates against another family again." Lisa looked at Isaiah, who was doing homework at their kitchen table, his face scrunched in concentration over a math problem. "I'm willing to fight," she said. The testing process took 3 days. Jennifer sent a white woman named Sarah, a volunteer tester with the Fair Housing Center, to inquire about the Maple Grove property. Sarah called Richard Palmer, expressed interest, and was immediately invited to view the house that same afternoon. She toured the property, was shown every room, and was told she could move in within a week if she wanted it. She recorded everything, the conversation, Palmer's eager sales pitch, his assurances that it was a good neighborhood and that she would fit right in. The next day, Lisa called again, this time with Jennifer on the line listening. She identified herself clearly, used her real name, and asked to schedule a viewing. Richard Palmer's tone changed immediately. "Actually, I've got someone else very interested," he said. "The property's probably going to be off the market by end of week." When Lisa mentioned that she had heard otherwise, that a friend had viewed it just yesterday, Palmer became defensive and hostile. "Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but I choose my tenants carefully. I have the right to rent to whoever I want. Now, if you'll excuse me." The call ended abruptly, and Lisa sat in Jennifer's office feeling the full weight of the discrimination, the casual cruelty of being rejected for something she couldn't control and shouldn't have to. The lawsuit was filed within a week, naming Richard Palmer and Palmer Properties for violation of the Fair Housing Act, a federal law that prohibits discrimination in housing based on race. The case was ironclad, supported by recorded conversations, documented testing, and Palmer's own contradictory statements. Jennifer explained that they were seeking an injunction to compel him to rent the property to Lisa at the advertised rate, as well as monetary damages for the emotional distress and civil rights violation. "He's going to fight this," Jennifer warned. "Men like him always do. They think their property rights trump everything else, including federal law. But we have him dead to rights, and eventually he'll have to comply or face serious penalties." Lisa signed the papers with hands that shook slightly, not from fear but from the enormity of what she was doing. She was standing up not just for herself and Isaiah, but for every person who had been turned away from a home because of the color of their skin. The fight was just beginning, but for the first time in weeks, Lisa felt something like hope. Richard Palmer's response to the lawsuit was exactly what Jennifer had predicted: denial, outrage, and a complete refusal to accept any wrongdoing. His attorney, a local lawyer named Tom Brennan who specialized in property law, filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that Palmer had the right to choose his tenants based on legitimate business concerns, that there was no proof of racial discrimination, that this was simply a case of a landlord exercising his property rights. But the evidence was too strong, the testing too clear, the recorded conversations too damning. The judge assigned to the housing discrimination case reviewed the materials and issued a preliminary ruling that stunned Palmer and his attorney. Not only was the motion to dismiss denied, but the court ordered that Lisa Thompson be allowed to move into the Maple Grove property immediately at the advertised rent, and that Richard Palmer could not evict her without cause for the duration of a standard lease agreement. Furthermore, the discrimination case would proceed to determine damages. For Richard Palmer, this ruling wasn't just a legal defeat, it was a personal humiliation and assault on everything he believed about his rights as a property owner and his place in the social hierarchy. And that's when his harassment began. Lisa and Isaiah moved into the house on Maple Grove Avenue on a sunny Saturday in April. Despite everything that had happened, despite knowing that their landlord hated them, Lisa was determined to make this work, to give Isaiah the stable home and good school district she had fought so hard to secure. The house itself was even better than the photos had suggested, with high ceilings, plenty of natural light, and a backyard with an old oak tree perfect for climbing. Isaiah ran through the rooms with unbridled joy, claiming the smallest bedroom as his own, talking excitedly about inviting his friends over. Lisa stood in the kitchen, unpacking boxes, and allowed herself to believe that maybe the worst was over, that now they could just live their lives in peace. She should have known better. Richard Palmer's white pickup truck pulled into the driveway 2 hours after they arrived, and he walked up to the house with heavy, deliberate steps that made his anger clear before he even knocked on the door. The first confrontation set the tone for everything that would follow. Lisa opened the door to find Richard Palmer standing on her porch, his face red, his jaw clenched, his whole posture radiating hostility. He was a big man, over 6 feet tall and heavily built from years of construction work, and he used his size to intimidate, standing too close, looming over her. "I want you to know something," he said without preamble, his voice low and threatening. "You might have some lawyer who forced me to rent to you, but this is still my property. I'll be watching everything you do. One violation of the lease, one missed rent payment, one noise complaint, and I'll have you out of here so fast your head will spin. You understand me?" Lisa, drawing on every ounce of strength she had, refused to be intimidated. "Mr. Palmer, we're going to be model tenants. We'll pay rent on time, we'll take care of the property, and we'll follow every rule in the lease. But you need to understand something, too. We have rights, and if you harass us, I won't hesitate to call my attorney." Palmer's eyes narrowed. "Harassment? Lady, I'm just making sure my property is protected. You people," and he loaded those 2 words with so much contempt that it landed like a slur, "have a habit of destroying property values. I'm watching you." He turned and walked back to his truck, but before getting in, he called back, "And tell your kid to stay out of my yard. He sets foot on my property next door, and we'll have problems." What Lisa didn't know was that Richard Palmer lived in the house directly adjacent to theirs, separated only by a small strip of lawn and a chain-link fence. He had deliberately not disclosed this in the rental agreement, and now Lisa understood why. He wasn't just their landlord, he was their neighbor, which meant he could monitor their every movement, could make their lives miserable in ways that would be hard to prove or prosecute. Over the following weeks, Palmer's harassment escalated from verbal intimidation to active interference with their lives. He would park his truck in a way that blocked their driveway, forcing Lisa to ask him to move it before she could leave for work. He would mow his lawn at 6 a.m. on weekend mornings, the noise waking them up. He installed a bright spotlight on his property that shined directly into Isaiah's bedroom window, making it hard for the boy to sleep. When Lisa planted flowers in the front yard, Palmer came over to inform her that she wasn't allowed to make any changes to the landscaping without his written permission, even though nothing in the lease prohibited it. Every interaction was designed to make them feel unwelcome, to remind them that despite the court order, Palmer still considered himself in control. Isaiah, with the resilience of children, tried to adapt to their new home despite the hostile presence next door. He made friends at his new school, brought home good grades, played in the backyard with the joy of a kid who had never had outdoor space before. But even he couldn't ignore Richard Palmer's constant surveillance. The man would stand at his window, watching them, his arms crossed, his face set in a permanent scowl. When Isaiah was playing basketball in the driveway, Palmer would come out and complain about the noise. When Isaiah's friends came over, Palmer would stand on his porch glaring at them until they felt uncomfortable and left. Lisa documented everything, took photos, kept detailed notes with dates and times, knowing that she might need this evidence eventually. But what she really wanted, what she prayed for every night, was for Palmer to just leave them alone, to accept that they had the right to live in this house in peace. That prayer would never be answered. The situation reached a new level of danger in late October, 6 months after they had moved in. Isaiah had been playing in the backyard, raking leaves into a pile to jump in when his basketball rolled over the fence into Palmer's yard. It was an accident, the kind of thing that happens with kids and balls and fences, something that any reasonable neighbor would simply toss back with a smile. But Richard Palmer was not a reasonable neighbor. He picked up the basketball, walked to the fence, and instead of returning it, he deflated it with a knife while Isaiah watched, horrified. "I told you to keep your stuff on your own property," Palmer said coldly. "Consider this your warning. Next time something comes into my yard, I'm keeping it. And if you set foot over this fence to get it, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Isaiah ran inside crying, and when Lisa called Palmer to confront him, he hung up on her. She filed another complaint with the Fair Housing Center, but Jennifer explained that while Palmer's behavior was reprehensible, proving that it constituted illegal harassment rather than just being a terrible neighbor was difficult. They needed something more concrete, something that crossed the line from hostility into actual danger. They would get it, but the price would be unthinkable. November brought the first cold snap, and with it, the need to turn on the heating systems. The house on Maple Grove had an old gas furnace in the basement, and Lisa had it inspected by a professional at the start of the season, as any responsible tenant would. The inspector had given it a clean bill of health, noting that while it was an older unit, it was functioning properly and safely. Lisa kept the inspection report in her files, along with all the other documentation of her tenancy. On the night of November 15th, a Friday, Lisa came home from her evening shift at the hospital exhausted and looking forward to the weekend. Isaiah had been staying with her sister during her late shifts, and she picked him up on the way home, listening to him chatter about his day, about the science project he was working on, about the basketball game he wanted to watch. They got home around 11 p.m., both tired, both ready for bed. Lisa did her usual routine, checking that the doors were locked, that Isaiah brushed his teeth, that his homework was ready for Monday. She kissed him goodnight, told him she loved him, and went to her own room. She was asleep within minutes, completely unaware that in the basement something was very, very wrong. The carbon monoxide detector in the hallway started beeping at 3:17 a.m., a shrill, insistent alarm that cut through Lisa's sleep like a knife. She woke up confused, disoriented, her head pounding, feeling nauseous and dizzy. It took her several seconds to recognize the sound, to understand what it meant, and when she did, pure terror flooded her system. Carbon monoxide, colorless, odorless, deadly. She stumbled out of bed, calling for Isaiah, her movements uncoordinated, her thoughts sluggish from the poison already in her system. She got to his room, shook him, screamed his name, but he wouldn't wake up. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow and irregular. Lisa's nursing training kicked in despite her own impairment. She grabbed Isaiah, pulled him into her arms, and somehow made it to the front door, down the porch steps, onto the front lawn where the cold November air hit her face like a shock. She laid Isaiah on the grass, checked for a pulse, started CPR while screaming for help, her voice raw and desperate in the quiet pre-dawn darkness. Lights came on in neighboring houses. Someone called 911, and Richard Palmer, watching from his window next door, turned away and closed his curtains. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, their sirens cutting through the pre-dawn silence of Maple Grove Avenue. Lisa was still performing CPR on Isaiah when they took over, their movements efficient and practiced as they assessed the situation, administered oxygen, loaded both mother and son into the ambulance. Lisa's mind was a blur of terror and confusion, her body still affected by the carbon monoxide poisoning, her heart breaking as she watched the paramedics work on her son's small, still form. At the hospital, she was treated for moderate carbon monoxide exposure, while Isaiah was rushed to intensive care with severe poisoning. The hours that followed were the longest of Lisa's life, sitting in a waiting room while doctors fought to save her son, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening, bargaining with the universe to take her instead. When the doctor finally emerged, his face told her everything before he spoke a word. Isaiah Thompson was pronounced dead at 6:42 a.m. on November 16th. He was 10 years old. The fire department investigation of the Maple Grove house began that same morning. What they found in the basement chilled investigators to the bone. The gas line leading to the furnace had been deliberately tampered with, the connection loosened just enough to allow carbon monoxide to leak into the house while appearing intact upon casual inspection. The furnace's safety mechanisms had been disabled, the vents blocked. This was not an accident, not a malfunction, not a tragic coincidence. This was attempted murder, and it had succeeded in killing a child. The lead investigator, a veteran named Tom Rodriguez, who had seen countless house fires and gas leaks, documented everything with grim thoroughness. He had children of his own, and the thought that someone had deliberately created this death trap made his hands shake with rage as he took photographs and collected evidence. The police were called immediately, and within hours, the investigation shifted from accident to homicide. The evidence against Richard Palmer began to accumulate quickly once investigators knew what they were looking for. Security cameras from neighboring houses captured Palmer entering Lisa's rental property through the basement door at 2 a.m. the night before the poisoning, staying inside for approximately 20 minutes, then leaving. His own home security system, ironically, had recorded him returning to his house, checking his watch, and looking toward the rental property with an expression that witnesses would later describe as anticipation. When detectives searched Palmer's garage, they found tools with gas residue, internet search history showing queries about carbon monoxide poisoning and furnace sabotage, and handwritten notes calculating how long it would take for a leak to become lethal. He had planned this murder methodically, had researched the method, had waited for the right moment when both Lisa and Isaiah would be home and asleep. The only thing that had saved Lisa was the carbon monoxide detector, a device Palmer had apparently not known was recently installed. Richard Palmer was arrested 3 days after Isaiah's death, charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder, and multiple counts of violating federal housing discrimination laws. His arraignment was a media spectacle with news cameras capturing the moment he was led into court in an orange jumpsuit, his face showing not remorse but anger, the rage of a man who believed he was the victim in this situation. When the judge read the charges, Palmer actually laughed, a bitter sound that made everyone in the courtroom recoil. "This is ridiculous," he said, interrupting the proceedings. "That house is my property. I have the right to do whatever I want with my own property. You can't prove I did anything wrong." His attorney tried to quiet him, but Palmer continued ranting about property rights, about how he was being persecuted for standing up for his beliefs. The judge, visibly disgusted, set bail at $5 million and ordered Palmer held pending trial. As he was led from the courtroom, Palmer turned and looked directly at Lisa Thompson, who sat in the gallery surrounded by family, her face hollow with grief. "You never should have moved into my house," he said coldly before the bailiffs pulled him away. The trial began 8 months later on a humid July morning. The Wayne County Courthouse was packed with spectators, journalists, community activists, and members of both families. The case had become a lightning rod for discussions about housing discrimination, racial violence, and the limits of property rights. At the prosecution table sat District Attorney Michelle Harper, a skilled attorney known for her passionate advocacy and meticulous preparation. She had built her case around the physical evidence, the video footage, Palmer's own internet searches, and the testimony of experts who would explain exactly how he had created the death trap. Across the aisle sat Palmer with his defense attorney, Daniel Wright, who faced an impossible task, defending a client whose guilt was clear and whose behavior had been so reprehensible that generating any sympathy seemed hopeless. Palmer had refused a plea deal that would have spared him life without parole, insisting he had done nothing wrong, that he was defending his property rights. His attorney knew this arrogance would destroy him, but there was nothing he could do to save a client determined to self-destruct. The judge assigned to the case was Keisha Williams, a relatively young jurist at 38 years old, but one with a growing reputation for fairness and intelligence. Judge Williams was a black woman who had grown up in Detroit, who had fought her way through law school while working full-time, who had become a judge because she believed the legal system could be a force for justice if the right people were willing to fight for it. What the public didn't know, what wasn't in her official biography, was that Judge Williams had her own history with housing discrimination. When she was 7 years old, her family had been forced out of their home by a landlord who didn't want black tenants in his building. They had spent months living in temporary housing, moving from place to place, her education disrupted, her sense of security shattered. That experience had shaped her understanding of how housing instability affected children, how discrimination wasn't just an abstract concept, but a force that destroyed lives. As she looked at the case file for Richard Palmer, at the photos of Isaiah Thompson, she felt a familiar anger rising, tempered by professional discipline, but no less real. Michelle Harper's opening statement was devastating in its simplicity. She told the jury about Lisa Thompson, a hardworking single mother who wanted nothing more than a safe home for her son. She described their search for housing, the discrimination they faced, the legal fight they won to move into the Maple Grove property. She walked through Palmer's campaign of harassment, each incident documented and proven, and then she described the night of November 15th, using medical testimony and expert analysis to explain how Palmer had turned their home into a gas chamber, how he had calculated the dosage, how he had created conditions that would kill while he watched from next door. Richard Palmer didn't just discriminate against his family, Harper said, her voice ringing with conviction. He didn't just harass them. When the law forced him to let them live in his property, he decided that if he couldn't evict them legally, he would murder them. And he succeeded in killing a 10-year-old boy whose only crime was existing while black. The courtroom was silent, many jurors visibly emotional as Harper returned to her seat. Daniel Wright's opening statement was brief and defensive. He acknowledged that Palmer had opposed renting to the Thompson family, but argued this was a business decision, not racism. He claimed the gas leak was accidental, that the evidence against Palmer was circumstantial, that reasonable doubt existed. It was a weak argument and everyone knew it, including Wright himself. But Palmer had insisted on this defense, had refused to admit wrongdoing, and his attorney was bound to represent him even in a losing cause. Throughout Wright's statement, Palmer sat with his arms crossed, nodding along, apparently convinced that his attorney was making compelling points. His disconnect from reality was jarring, a warning sign that his courtroom behavior would likely make a bad situation worse. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks. The fire investigator testified about the deliberate tampering with the gas line, the disabled safety features, the blocked vents. Video forensic experts showed the footage of Palmer entering the basement hours before the poisoning. Computer specialists walked through his internet search history, showing the jury screenshots of searches like, "How long does carbon monoxide take to kill, and can carbon monoxide poisoning be traced?" Medical examiners described Isaiah's death in clinical detail, explaining how carbon monoxide had replaced oxygen in his blood, how his young body had shut down, how he had likely been unconscious and unable to cry for help. Lisa Thompson took the stand to describe the night she had lost her son, her testimony interrupted by sobs but also marked by a strength that moved everyone watching. When Harper asked her to describe Isaiah, Lisa spoke about his dreams of becoming a teacher, his kindness to other children, his joy in finally having a backyard to play in. "He was just a little boy," Lisa said, tears streaming down her face. "He deserved to grow up. He deserved a chance at life, and this man took that away because he hated us for being black." Throughout the testimony, Richard Palmer's behavior grew increasingly disturbing. He showed no emotion during the medical examiner's description of Isaiah's death. He smirked when video of him entering the basement was played. During Lisa's testimony, he was observed shaking his head and muttering under his breath. His attorney repeatedly had to warn him to control his reactions, but Palmer seemed incapable of grasping the severity of his situation. When the prosecution rested its case, the mountain of evidence was insurmountable, a comprehensive narrative of premeditated murder motivated by racial hatred. The defense called only 2 witnesses, a property rights advocate who testified about landlord rights, and a character witness who described Palmer as a responsible businessman. Both were demolished under cross-examination, and the defense rested after less than a day. The confrontation came during closing arguments. Michelle Harper delivered a powerful summary of the evidence, the timeline, the motive. She spoke about how racial hatred had motivated Palmer's initial discrimination, how that hatred had festered when the law forced him to comply, how it had finally exploded into murderous violence. As she spoke, Palmer's face grew redder, his breathing heavier, his agitation visible, and when Harper said, "Richard Palmer thought his property rights gave him the power to decide who lived and who died," Palmer shot to his feet, shouting, "That's my house! Mine! I built it with my own hands. I have the right to decide who lives there." The courtroom erupted. Bailiffs moved toward Palmer. Judge Williams's gavel came down hard, 3 sharp strikes demanding order. "Mr. Palmer, you will sit down immediately." Palmer turned to face the bench, and what he said next sealed his fate beyond any doubt. "You're just like them," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, his eyes traveling deliberately over Judge Williams's face. "You think because some activist judge gave you a robe you can tell me what to do? You people always stick together. This whole trial is rigged because you're all the same." The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in the courtroom understood what they had just witnessed, a defendant making an explicitly racist attack on the judge, revealing the hatred that had motivated his crime. Judge Williams sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the bench, her expression calm but her eyes blazing with controlled fury. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the room. "Mr. Palmer, you will be held in contempt of court. Bailiffs, remove the defendant." As the officers grabbed his arms, Palmer continued shouting, "This isn't justice. This is revenge. You're all against me because I'm white and I stood up for my rights." He was dragged from the courtroom, still ranting, and Judge Williams declared a recess until the following morning. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman, a middle-aged white man who worked as an engineer, stood and delivered the verdict with visible emotion. "In the matter of the state of Michigan versus Richard Palmer on the count of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Guilty on all counts: murder, attempted murder, federal civil rights violations." Lisa Thompson collapsed in relief and grief, held up by her family. Michelle Harper closed her eyes in gratitude. And in the holding cell where he watched via video feed, Richard Palmer sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that his arrogance had destroyed him. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Before pronouncing sentence, Judge Williams invited victim impact statements. Lisa Thompson approached the podium carrying a framed photo of Isaiah. Her voice was steady despite her tears as she spoke about her son's life, his dreams, the future that had been stolen. "Isaiah wanted to be a teacher," she said. "He wanted to help other kids learn to read. He was kind and funny and full of life. And Richard Palmer killed him because he didn't think we deserved to live in his house. He killed my baby because of hate." When she finished, she looked at Palmer and said simply, "I hope you spend the rest of your life thinking about what you took from me. I hope you see Isaiah's face every single day." Judge Williams allowed a moment of silence, then began to speak, and her words would be remembered long after the trial ended. "Mr. Palmer, I have presided over many cases in my years on the bench, but I have rarely encountered a defendant who has shown such complete absence of remorse, such profound inability to recognize his own evil." She paused, her gaze fixed on Palmer. "You discriminated against Lisa Thompson and her son. When the law forced you to stop discriminating, you harassed them. And when harassment wasn't enough, you tried to murder them both. You succeeded in killing a 10-year-old child, and throughout this trial you have shown not a single moment of regret." Her voice grew stronger. "You spoke during this trial about your property rights, about your house, about your rights. But let me be clear, your property rights do not include the right to discriminate. They do not include the right to harass, and they certainly do not include the right to murder. Judge Williams leaned forward, her next words carrying the weight of personal experience. You also made racist comments directed at me and at this court. You suggested that I could not be fair because of my race. Let me tell you something about my experience, Mr. Palmer. When I was 7 years old, my family was evicted from our home by a landlord who didn't want black tenants. We spent months moving from place to place. I watched my mother cry herself to sleep because she couldn't provide stability for her children. I know what housing discrimination does to families. I know what it does to children. Her voice was controlled but filled with emotion. So, yes, I understand this case deeply. But I will not sentence you because of my personal experience. I will sentence you based on what you did, on the evidence presented, on the law. You murdered a child in cold blood because of racial hatred. You planned it meticulously. You showed no remorse, and the law is clear about what happens to people who do what you did. Judge Williams picked up the sentencing document, her voice becoming formal and final. Richard Palmer, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Isaiah Thompson. You will serve an additional 20 years for the attempted murder of Lisa Thompson and 10 years for federal civil rights violations, all sentences to run consecutively. You will die in prison, Mr. Palmer. You will never again see the outside of a prison wall. The gavel came down with the sound of justice served. Palmer's face went white, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. No, he finally whispered. No, this isn't my property, my rights. His voice rose to a shout. This is because of her, he pointed at Judge Williams. This is revenge. You can't do this. Judge Williams looked at him with an expression of complete calm. Justice is exactly what this is, Mr. Palmer. Justice for Isaiah Thompson, who will never grow up. Justice for Lisa Thompson, who will live with this pain forever. Justice for every family you would have harmed if we had let you continue. Take him away. As bailiffs dragged Palmer from the courtroom, still screaming about his property rights and his persecution, Lisa Thompson sat with Isaiah's photo pressed to her chest, tears of relief and sorrow mixing together. Judge Williams met her eyes across the courtroom and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, a gesture between two women who understood what it meant to fight for a place to call home and what it cost when that home was turned into hell by someone's hatred. The trial was over. The sentence had been given. And while nothing could bring Isaiah back, there was at least this. His killer would never harm another child, and the law had spoken clearly that housing discrimination, harassment, and racial violence would not be tolerated. In a system that too often failed people who looked like Lisa and Isaiah Thompson, this time justice had been served,